My name is Maria Cardarelli Pusanghero, and the story that I'm about to tell you is a true story, and I call it Katja. It was the year 1940. World War II was raging throughout Europe. In my hometown of San Donato, Valle di Comino, Italy, a miracle happened during those frightening years of the war. I was a teenage girl at the time, living with my mother and two younger sisters in that medieval town perched way up on a slope of the Apennine Mountains. The houses, made of stones and built against a rugged mountainside, look as though they are built one on top of the other, with big doors, thick walls, and smallish windows. The windows are all different, one from the other, in shape and size. Some are round, some square, some resemble niches, and some others are like arches. They are placed at random on the facade of the houses, and they seem to have many voices recounting stories of the past. The narrow, crooked, cobblestone streets, rising high up the rugged sides of the mountains, challenge even the sturdiest of the townspeople who must climb them. My sister and I walked single file on the narrow sidewalks as we climbed the 225 steps in order to go from my house to my grandparents' house, which is located in the historical section of the town. During the winter, we could hear the howling of the wolves coming down from the mountains that circled the town like a protective wall, which reminded us that wild animals lived up there along with brown bears and chamois. At that time, the war did not have a face for me. Hitler and Mussolini were far away until one day a group of Jewish people was sent by the Italian government to my hometown. They were foreigners and mostly women who had escaped to Italy from countries less friendly toward Jews. Approximately 16 were sent to my town. They had been given orders to remain there until further notice. They were not allowed to work, and the government gave them a small stipend every month for their basic needs. They were called internees. Among the people who were sent to my town, there was a couple called Ulla and Mark Tenenbaum. They were looking for a room to rent, and since we had an extra room in my house, my mother rented to them. Mark was a doctor, and whenever he heard of people in town in need of medical attention, he would not hesitate to care for them. As Mark continued to care for the people of the town, they showed their gratitude by compensating him the only way they could, with food, such as eggs, a bottle of olive oil, flour, and fruit. This helped to feed his family and mine, as we all lived together in my house as though we were one family. Therefore, I was very confused about my government's policy towards these Jewish people, calling them enemies of the country. To me, they were the most wonderful people. While living with us, Ulla gave birth to a little girl and named her Katja. Katja was like a living doll for us. We made all the things she needed, such as blankets, pillows, and clothing. And when she started talking, she called my mother Ma. One morning in January 1944, the sun had not yet made it over the mountains. The town and the valley were still laced in the white light of dawn. We heard the rumbling of trucks approaching the town. We held our breath and listened. German Nazi soldiers had come to my town to round up all the Jewish people. Panic took over the whole town. Confusion and anxiety reflected on everybody's faces. as the people of the town looked out through the smallish windows of their homes, while the German Nazi pushed the Jewish people inside their trucks and took them away. We never heard from them again. Ulla and Mark Tenenbaum and some of the other Jewish people successfully escaped into the mountains. They hid in the mountains and lived like nomads, exposed to the harsh elements of the duration of the war. The local people made trips up and down to where the Jewish people were hiding and provide them with food and blankets. Due to the harsh wintry condition, Ulla and Mark had to leave little Katja behind with us. At this time, my mother changed Katja's name to Grazia. One day in April 1944, Ulla was taken by a great desire to see her daughter. So she came down from the mountains in broad daylight to my house and knocked on the front door. When my mother opened the door and saw her, my mother's face turned ashen. She said, "Ulla, do you realize what you have done? You have placed in danger your life, the life of your daughter, the lives of my daughter as well as mine, and the lives of all the people of the town." Ulla replied, "Don't worry, nobody has seen me." In fact, Ulla had been seen by a Nazi sympathizer and was reported to the local Nazi headquarters. About a half an hour later, two heavily armed Nazi soldiers and the sympathizer were knocking at the door of my house. My mother opened the door. They inquired as to whereabouts of Ulla, as well as Mark and Katja. My mother replied, "I have no idea. I have not seen them in months." It was a miracle that the soldier and the sympathizer never entered the house. My mother shut the door and fainted. Her knees went first, and she started to tremble. She seemed about to squat, and then I saw her on the floor, lifeless. I was frightened. I thought my mother was dead. I screamed. Ulla came out of the bathroom where she had been hiding. She knelt beside my mother and cradled my mother's head in her arms. My mother came to almost immediately, but she seemed to not know where she was. "Maria, get a glass of water," Ulla said. Reluctantly, I left the room. My hands were trembling as I turned on the faucet of the kitchen sink. I filled a glass with water and returned to the room where my mother and Ulla were. When I got there, my mother was sitting in a chair. Ulla looked at me and asked, "Are you all right, Maria? Your face is white like a ghost." At this point, my mother said to Ulla, "You must leave the house now." Ulla said, "I will leave tonight when it's dark." My mother said, "No, we must find a way to get you out of here immediately because the German and Nazis will be back." Now, my mother and her neighbors were faced with the problem of how to get Ulla out of town because they knew that the soldiers would return very soon. So they come up with the idea of putting Ulla, a small person, into a large harvest basket. They covered it with a cloth and they topped it with chicken manure. Costanza Rufo, a strong woman of the neighborhood, made a donut out of cloth and put it on her head. With my mother's help, she hoisted the basket up onto her head. The idea was to deceive the Nazi into believing that she was going to bring fertilizer to the fields. Once out in the fields, Ulla got out of the basket and ran away up the mountains. Another miracle. Meanwhile, my mother dressed Katja like a peasant girl and placed a kerchief over her head to cover her blonde curls. My mother instructed my sister Silvana to take Katja to our grandparents' house. Silvana hid Katja there and stayed with her until the crisis passed. All of this was taking place while the town was being bombarded and shelled by the Allied forces. They were trying to push the German army north. I remember that day. The sun looked as if it transpired through a black veil. The air was heavy. The town seems to be in the grip of an evil spirit. I worried about Katja and my sister as they walked to my grandparents' house. I also worried, would they be hit by a shell and be killed? And did Hula and Costanza make it to the fields? I asked myself, are we all going to get killed today? Is anybody going to be around tomorrow? That evening, I remember like it was yesterday, the town clock struck 6. My mother, my sister, and I were in the house. We heard heavy footsteps outside. My mother peeked out of a small window, and she saw 4 heavily armed Nazi soldiers surrounding the house. She put my sister and I inside a closet and put a heavy blanket on our heads. In the darkness, the fear was unbearable. I was taken by a spirit of heaviness. I found strength in reciting the Lord's Prayer. My mother kept going in and out of the closet all night. She was expecting the Nazis to start shooting and break windows and doors at any moment. But at dawn, the soldiers left and never came back. After the war ended, Ulla and Katja were reunited with Mark. Mark, Ulla, Katja, and Katja's brother Sasha, who was born after the war ended, all chose to remain in Italy, and they have lived there ever since. I see them quite often when I visit Italy, and when they visit the United States. At Christmas time in 1998, Katja came to visit the United States. We all had a big reunion and dinner at my house in Newton, Massachusetts, along with my family and my sister Silvana and her family. When Katja came into my house, I welcomed her and I hugged her and I said to her, "What a miracle to see you in America." She replied, "The miracle happened in 1944.